Who was the guy?
The guy? You didn't see the
guy with the creepy mustache?
Yeah. Billy Bob, my cousin, he couldn't make it.
I thought it was Steve Joe.
He goes by both.
Oh.
Either one's good. So yeah, he couldn't make it. Which I'm glad the topic's not on Windows because he said it was on pain and suffering, and then he gave me details. You can see it's much smaller. I figured I would start off, or I thought it might be appropriate rather, to start off with a few magic tricks just because magic tricks. And I think it might be appropriate.
Yes.
Yes?
Please do.
Okay. So, Ariel.
Yes.
Do you know how many cards are in the deck? Just off the top of your head.
I do it
52. Took her glasses off. She said 52. So, 52 cards in the deck. And then, of course, you have your royals, right? Which are your ace, king, queen, jack. And then you've got like 1 through 10, say like 3. So pick a number between 1 through 10. Don't make it 3, so just say 3. You got it?
Yes.
What is it?
Wait. Why do you need to go?
Just tell me what it is.
I got 7.
7 of what?
You didn't ask me to pick this.
Well, you have 4 different choices. You have clubs, spades.
Okay, I got it.
What is it?
Straight.
Spades?
Yeah.
You sure?
Yeah.
Okay. I actually had the deck of cards with me. And if you want, why don't you hand that to her and just hold it in your hand and pretend that you're turning the 7 over.
Just pretend.
In your mind, just like pretend that you're turning the 7 over and flipping it upside down, so it's the only one facing up.
Okay.
You doing that?
Yeah.
You done it?
Yeah.
You think it worked?
No.
I don't think it did either. Just pull the deck out
Okay.
and then sort of span the cards out. If you're gonna like fan them out so that the cards are facing you.
Oh.
Maybe this takes around. Is there one that maybe?
No way. No way.
I'm not gonna touch
No
it.
way.
Is
No way. What is this? What is this? Is this the card?
Wow,
No way.
you did really good.
I know it is.
You were in your mind.
That was cool.
Can everybody hear me okay?
No, I'm not very good.
Speak up.
Can everybody hear me okay?
You talk a little louder.
Okay. Well, congrats.
Thank you.
So I had another magic trick, and I was talking to Jonathan the other day. I think a lot of the questions that we have about pain and suffering and about different things sort of fall under one umbrella. So when you start talking about free will and determinism, it automatically you start talking about ethics, and then you start talking about God, and then pain and suffering. And I think most of us in this room, I don't know if all of us are, most of us in this room would be considered compatibilist. And what a compatibilist is someone who thinks that free will and determinism are logically compatible. Meaning, so for example, if me and you were going to sit down and play a game of chess, in order to freely play the game, we have to set some rules, right? Otherwise we can't freely play. Does that make sense? So that's what a compatibilist would be, kind of sort of the basic idea. Now some people on the opposite end of the spectrum would be called an incompatibilist, meaning they don't think it. They think everything's predetermined in advance and that free will is not compatible with determinism. So, second and last magic trick, I have a few items here, and I need another volunteer. So you guys thought it was just going to be about pain and suffering. It's all magic tricks. So, the first item would be a Capri Sun little satchel. And the first question you might ask is, did I make this? Yes. The answer is yes, I did make this. The second item is My Little Pony. And you may think I just may have insulted by calling her little, but she likes to be called little. It's really not a big deal. The third item is a loofah. And you might ask yourself, is that his loofah? Did he bring his loofah here? Is that a used loofah? Is that in fact his used loofah? And the answer is, I'm not going to tell you. I'm not going to tell you. So I need a volunteer. Lionel.
Yeah.
Since you're ready.
I don't know.
I'm going to make a prediction. Okay? And then we'll see if my prediction turns out to be true. I probably should have done this beforehand. Let me know how I spell loofah.
I know I don't.
You barely speak English. Okay. So, Lionel,
Yes.
sir, tell me which two items you would like me to touch.
First two to
Top
touch.
of your head.
The pony in the bag.
Pony in the bag. Okay, now tell me to lift one hand.
Lift one hand.
The right or the left? Which one?
The right.
Lift this hand.
Right.
Okay. Now, would you like the pony or would you like the loofah?
The pony.
You want the pony?
Yes.
Okay. Toss left hip. Okay. Would you like to change your mind? This is your chance. Would you
No.
like to switch with me?
That's yours. No.
Okay. This is mine. You don't know that. I didn't tell you that.
Huh?
You could pass this to him. And you could read that out loud for me, Lionel. Let's see.
But this part makes me look like a punk because I wanted a pony.
Read out loud. So we can hear.
I'm holding the pony. He's holding the loofah. The bag is on the tape. Man.
So did you feel like you had a free choice there? Like you could have changed your mind, right?
Here, take your pony.
So,
Man, that's crazy.
like in a nutshell, that's just a sort of an example of why I think free will is compatible with. Hey, give me my pony back.
Why'd I pick the pony?
Huh?
Why'd I pick the pony?
That's your decision.
Am I soft?
Obviously, you're upset about
Tell me my future.
But in sort of the short version of that, that's why I think free will is compatible with determinism, meaning that even though the outcome may be predetermined in advance, it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have a free choice, because God could work that out in a different way. Does that make sense at all, maybe? Okay, now on to pain and suffering. God, big detour there. It's a good thing it's not about women. We'll be here all night. I have an outline here, and I may follow it. I'm going to try to follow it, because if I don't, I do quite a few like digressions. If I don't have an outline, I talk like this. And I eventually make it back to the point, but if I have an outline, I'm pretty straightforward. Okay. So, there's a couple versions to this argument that I could cover. However, one being the intellectual argument, and then, or the intellectual problem, and then one being the emotional problem. I'm not going to cover the emotional problem because the emotional problem basically says I don't like a God that could allow pain and suffering. And most of the time their arguments are very weak and not very good. And I think a lot of people who have arguments against an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God and the existence of evil fall under this category, but they might not know it. In other words, their ideas and thoughts about God are based on more of feelings and not necessarily logic or intellect. So, the intellectual problem basically sort of branches off into two parts. One being the logical version, and then one being the probabilistic version. I'm going to cover the logical version first, and then the probabilistic version. All good? Okay. So the logical version is kind of boring, so I'll try to go through it sort of fast. The logical version basically says, in a nutshell, that it's impossible for an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-loving God to coexist with good and evil. That it's just logically incoherent. Like from the premises, from A plus B does not equal C, basically. And for like 50 years, up until about 50 years ago, this was the main sort of argument. Like from Epicurus to David Hume to all these philosophers, they would say, okay, it's just logically impossible. But we have to ask ourselves, are there some presuppositions being made? And presupposition is basically just a big word for assumption. You know, are there assumptions being made in this argument? Is there any way we can sort of tackle it? The first assumption would be, if God is all-powerful, then He can create any world that He wants. Now, first off, we have to ask ourselves what we mean when we say He's all-powerful. So, for example, if we say, can God make a married bachelor? Can He create a round square? Can He make me freely do something? Well, of course not. If He makes me freely do it, then I don't really have the freedom to make the decision to do it. Does that make sense? Something maybe? Yes? No? Okay. Yeah. Got it? Okay. So, saying that God can do just anything doesn't necessarily make it true. I mean, if I said bish, bosh, bishy wash, I mean, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So, saying that God can do just logically incoherent things doesn't mean that He can do it. You know. So we have to ask ourselves, what can God do realistically and within logic? So if God creates human beings with the capacity to choose freely between good and evil, the choices between A and B, then He cannot create a world in which the probability is not a possibility. In other words, He can't create a world in which I always freely do the right thing. Because if He creates that world, then I'm not doing the right thing because I don't have a choice in it. So the possibility is always a necessity. It's based on me having the choices between A and B. Is everybody following me? If you get lost, or if I say something, just ask me and I'll try to clarify. The second assumption that this makes is that if God is all-loving, He prefers a world without suffering. Now, in Christianity, we're not sort of God's play toys. You know, our goal in life is not happiness. You know, our goal in life in Christianity is to have a better knowledge of God, however that may be. And that may entail, you know, suffering. I think we can all think of some sort of instances in our lives to where had something bad not have happened, we might not have, the greater good might not have come about. I think most of us can probably assume, you know, that's the case. And basically, let's see where I'm at here. Basically what the non-believer would have to demonstrate or prove is that God doesn't have morally sufficient reasons for allowing pain and suffering. So it could be very, very well the case that He has morally sufficient reasons for allowing the pain and suffering. And really no atheist, agnostic, non-believer has ever been able to show what those, you know, ever been able to disprove that. They've never, it's kind of, you can't disprove that, if that makes sense. So, that is basically the logical version in a nutshell, and why it's logically possible, given that He makes human beings with the capacity to choose between A and B, You cannot create a world in which I only choose A. I only choose good, because then I wouldn't be free. So, but we're sort of where the arguments move now to is what's called the probabilistic version. And this basically says, okay, well, it's logically possible that God could create a world in which I have the capacity to do these things, but it's highly improbable that He's good. In other words, it's highly improbable that an all-loving God would allow so much suffering. That's basically the argument. But we do have to ask ourselves, when we make such claims, are we in a position, or as sort of finite beings and creatures that only live 60 to 80 years on this planet, do we have enough information just based on the suffering to know whether or not that's the case, that it's completely improbable? And I think a few things that address this the best would be a couple of them. There's actually three of them. I might cover all three. The first one would actually be in science. So, has anybody ever heard of the butterfly effect? Maybe, probably. Basically in science, it's called chaos theory. And what this says is, sort of in large-scale systems, there are certain little fractals that are so sensitive to the environment that we cannot predict what happens. So, basic example would be a butterfly flapping its wings in South America somehow causes a thunderstorm in Texas. I mean, no one in their rational mind would think, looking at that butterfly, in about a couple of days there's going to be a thunderstorm in Texas. We just don't have enough information to make those type of predictions. So that would be sort of the first example of where, in such large-scale systems, if we say that God it's just highly improbable because of all the suffering, well, we only have a certain amount of knowledge that we can go on, and this very, very well might be a world that a good God will allow to happen. If that makes sense. The second example, and I got these from a philosopher that I thought was pretty good. I had to watch this movie, but the second example of why I think that it's not necessarily improbable, it's a movie called Sliding Doors. Has anybody ever seen that? So, it's a movie, it's kind of a rom-com, forgive me. It's with Gwyneth Paltrow, and it came out kind of in the early 2000s. So, at one part of the movie, the first part of the movie, she's rushing down the stairs and she's trying to catch a train. And the first part of the movie, she is unable to make the train because there's a little kid playing with her doll, and she's in the way. She can't get to the train on time, so she misses the train. Now, this is where the movie sort of splits off into two different scenes. In the other scene, the dad snatches the kid just in time, and she's able to get on the train and make the train. Now, just by this small little thing that happened, this seemingly insignificant event, her life sort of branches off into two different scenarios. In the one life, it's filled with success, everything's going well, she's got just starts a new job, meets a new boyfriend, everything's going great. In the other scenario, it's filled with sort of angst, and she's having to work two jobs. She doesn't meet the boyfriend. None of that stuff happens. Now the twist is at the end. In the life filled with happiness and everything's going great, she's abruptly killed in a car crash. Just instantly dies. Now, and in the second one, filled with strife, anxiety, pain, all that stuff, she ends up meeting the boyfriend at the end, and everything turns out better than the one that looked good. So I think that would be another example of just something bad happening in our life. We just can't see can't see any rhyme or reason for it. It doesn't mean that there's not some sort of grand plan that we might not see. The third example would be the story of the Chinese farmer. Has anybody ever heard that? Probably not. It's kind of an old wives' tale. I think Jonathan's heard it before. So there's this Chinese farmer. He wakes up one day and he loses one of his horses. One of his horses has ran away. The townspeople, they gather together that night and they say, "Wow, that's terrible. We heard about your horse." He says, maybe. So the next day, he goes to bed, wakes up, same horse ends up bringing back 5 other horses. And the townspeople, they gather together that night and they say, "Wow, that's great. I can't believe you got all these horses back." He said, maybe. The next day, he goes to bed. I think you guys can see where this is going. The next day, goes to sleep. One of his kids is taming one of these horses. One of these new horses that have been brought in. And he gets bucked off and breaks his arm. And the townspeople gather together and they say, "Wow, that's awful. We heard about your kid." He said, it's not so bad. And then the final day, he wakes up and there's actually the army recruits have come in town that day. And they're doing a draft and they're going around house to house. And because his son's hurt, they don't draft him. They let him go. And the funny thing about this is ironically, we see this in terms of ethics. So like a non-believer or a person who doesn't believe in God, they see this, that we can't make these decisions based on our limited information that we have in other things. Like there's a philosophy called utilitarianism, which basically says we want to bring the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. It sounds good in practice. I want to bring the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. And the classic example would be the trolley problem. So you have one guy, some of you probably heard this. You have one guy on the train, he's strapped to the tracks. You have 10 guys on the train, they're strapped to the tracks. Now the utilitarian would say, we want to save the 10, because we want to bring the greatest amount of good to the greatest amount of people. But what we don't know is what if this guy over here is a doctor? What if he's a brain surgeon? We don't know. What if he's going to end up saving hundreds of lives? And then we kill him off and save the 10. So we don't end up bringing the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people. So we have to keep in mind that when we make probability judgments, they're all relative to the background information we have. When we make judgments, they're all based on sort of the background information that we possess at that given moment. So for instance, suppose I tell you that 90% of people that attend Duke University, 90% of the males that attend are social drinkers. They like to drink. And then I tell you Fred has just enrolled at Duke University. And he's a young man. Now, based on the information that we have, 90% of the chance, he's probably going to be a drinker. He's probably going to be a social drinker. But what if I told you that Fred has a liver disease and that 90% of people with this disease don't drink? Well, suddenly, relative to this new information that we have, completely changes. So we have to keep in mind that our perspective is directly correlated to the information that we have. And based on the information that we do have, we can't necessarily say that it's improbable that God is not a loving God or whatever. And we have to ask ourselves too, if it's improbable relative to what? As I mentioned earlier, like if we're just going based off the suffering in this world, then it could very well be the case that this is what the world would look like. If we have the freedom to choose between right, wrong, this, that. And I think what we assume too is that suffering is necessarily always a bad thing. So for instance, I can think of 5 things right now that suffering sort of leads to all sorts of virtues. So for example, courage. If you have no pain, you don't need to have courage, right? I mean, without suffering, you don't need to have courage. Patience would be another. Sympathy. If no one's suffering, then why should you be sympathetic? You have no need to be sympathetic. Charity. If nobody needs you, then why be unselfish? You know? And then the final one would be wisdom. I think we can all sort of attest to that. There are certain things in our life where maybe we're perfecting a craft or we're doing something and we're trying to end up gaining wisdom, but at the time it seems awful. You know, like we're just trying to get this thing done, but you know, had we not suffered a little bit, we wouldn't become smarter in a certain area or, you know, something like that. And I think where our sort of society gets it wrong is they say no suffering equals ultimate happiness. So, say I were to aid a homeless person. Say he's homeless, and I were to help him out one day, and I sort of get rid of his temporary suffering. Now, that seems on paper like a good thing, and it very well could be. But what if I'm a heroin addict, and maybe I've relieved his suffering in some way, but then I've sort of embedded him into maybe a life of addiction and pain and stuff like that. So getting rid of someone's suffering is not always a good thing. For example, there's actually a disease. It's called congenital insensitivity to pain, where people literally, they can't feel pain. It's like a very serious disease. They're always having to check themselves because they don't know when they're sick. So getting rid of pain and suffering doesn't just automatically just solve the problem. You know, if I can just wipe out the pain in someone's body, you know, there's actually, it's a very rare disease. There's actually people that have that, and it's a terrible thing. And two, so when people ask, well, why is there so much suffering if God's all good? Why is this the case? You see, we're already kind of assuming that suffering is an evil thing. But where do we get this idea of evil if there's not a God? And where do we get this idea of right and wrong? I mean, if nature is all there is, then there's nothing more natural than nature, right? If all there is just sort of, if we're just all sort of controlled by the laws of physics that are set in place, then saying that suffering is a necessary evil is placing a value judgment on it. And you can't necessarily do that if everything's sort of predetermined in advance. Because we're just acting the way we would act under these sort of certain conditions and pressures and temperatures, and if there is no God, right? I mean, for example, if I were to type on one computer, good, and hit print, and then I were to type on another computer, bad, and hit print, they're just programmed to do that. Neither one of them's good or bad. They're just pre-programmed for those things to happen. So, we can't always say that suffering is a bad thing. We have to ask ourselves, what's the foundation for it being evil, if it is evil? But, for hypothetical reasons, let's just suppose that God could lay out the grand narrative, that He could sort of tell us why we suffer. Now, do you think we would have the slightest idea of, or be able to comprehend that? I mean, imagine if you're a first grader and you're dropped into sort of a high-level physics class. Do you think you'll have the slightest clue what's going on? I mean, it very well could be the case that if God were to say, okay, I'll tell you what's up, you might just be like, what? I don't get any of that, you know? Like, so we kind of assume that we would know or understand the reasons if He did have any. So by the simple fact that we may not understand His reasons, it doesn't follow that He doesn't have any. So there's a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga who gives a wonderful example of this, and he sort of relates it to sandflies, or they're called, actually the sort of pop culture term for them is called no-see-ums. And they're sort of this little bitty bug that can't see, but they have this bite that's completely out of proportion to their size, you know. So suppose I'm out camping and I say, go ahead and look in that tent. Tell me if you can see any no-see-ums in there. Now, from the fact that I don't see any, it doesn't follow that there might not be some in there. Even if there was, I wouldn't see them, right? I mean, does that make sense? But since we're being hypothetical again, let's suppose that we could understand it, right? God could tell us the reason, and that we would totally get it. We would say, okay, got it. Now, I think this would be awful for two reasons. One, imagine God, every time you stubbed your toe, or every time you sort of bumped your head, God would whisper in your ear, you're going to be a better person because of this, and you're going to do great things because you hit your head, and you're going to be a better person. I mean, it would just, imagine that for 2 days, you know, like God just whisper in your ear everything bad that happened to you. He would just tell you, like, this is why this happened, and you're going to be the best person in the world, and all these things are going to come from it. You'd be like, please just don't tell me anything else. Stop. I don't want to know. I don't want to know why I clipped my fingernails too short. Just don't tell me. The second reason why I think it would be awful is it could be totally counterproductive. So imagine you have a family member that just died, and God wanted to tell you, okay, this is the reason it happened, you're going to be a better person because of this. And it could very well be the case that if he told you, you may completely reject it, and because out of your anger, right? You may be so mad, you may be like, I don't want to hear that, and you may do the exact opposite thing of what you would have done had he told you. So, for example, I mean, we all know that kid who you tell not to do something, he does it just because you tell him not to, right? I mean, he may know that, let's call it counterfactual. He may know that counterfactual in advance, so he doesn't tell you, if that makes sense. Or if he did tell you, it would sort of not be the best scenario. I don't know how much time we got. I want to quickly go over what I think is probably the best thing ever in literature that's ever dealt with this problem. And I don't just say this as a Christian. I study this stuff, and I really do think, and even people who don't believe in God say that this is probably the best critique of pain and suffering ever written. I want to go over it quickly, and then I'll give you sort of a personal example, and then we can maybe talk about some questions if you guys have any or something like that. So, the story of Job used to be my favorite story in the Bible. I don't know why it was. I just always thought it was a really good story. But in the story of Job, if you don't know it, sort of a brief synopsis, Job basically loses everything. Loses his sons, his daughters, his wife, his cattle. He has boils all over his skin. And what his friends do is they basically give him what's called theodicies, which is what I'm not doing. They give him reasons as to why God does something, which are always bad, you know. And Job realizes that these are bad things. He rejects them all. Like, you know, they say there are usually two things that we do when we react to pain and suffering. If we're a Christian, we say, "What have I done wrong? It must be because I've done something wrong," and we think it's because of that. The second one would be if you're a non-believer, you would just say, "Well, this is just how the world works, you know, and I wouldn't even believe in a God who would allow this to happen to me anyway." So those are the two basic things that how we react to suffering most of the time. But Job recognizes that all the answers that his friends give him, basically, you've done this wrong, you need to repent, he realizes that these are bad things. You know, these are not the answers, you know, like, and I think that's sort of the main point, is that we don't know, and that we're never going to know why, and that maybe we shouldn't know why pain and suffering exist in the world. And I think Job sort of realizes this. Because he never finds out. He never finds out at the end. You can read the whole book of Job, and he never finds out why he suffered. Never does. Pascal, which is one of my favorite philosophers, he says the last function of reason is to recognize that there are an infinity of things that surpass it. So basically what he's saying is reasons don't explain everything. So if I give you, if I say, what's the reason for this, and you give me an answer, I could always ask you another question. Why? Why? We kind of know that kid in class always goes, why? I mean, reasons don't explain everything, right? I mean, they can. But you may ask me, so, okay, since we can't know everything about pain and suffering, and since we don't know, what can we know? Well, if you believe in Christianity, what you can know is that He doesn't care. It's the only religion that you can say that about. So, if you believe that Jesus is who He said He was, then the one thing you can say about Him is that He doesn't care. Because He was willing to do it too. He was willing, He just says, trust me. You know, He's willing, if He's willing to suffer and die, just like me, then I may not know all the answers, but the one thing I do know is that He cares about me. Because He was willing to do it too. And you can't say that about any other religion, because no other religion does God enter into humanity and suffer and die like we do. There's one example that I think is, well, let me just say this about reason one more time. Why I don't think reasons explain everything. I think love, true love, is total sacrifice and expecting nothing in return. And if the sole reason why I loved a Mesa or my family was because of reasons, then I turn them into objects, right? If I loved them because of A, B, C, D, then I turn them into sort of objects to why I love them. There's always something left over. I can't really explain why, but I love them. I just do, right? You just love them because, you know, you don't know the reason why. It's just, of course, reasons explain a lot of things to why you love them, but there's always something that's left over of why you can't really fully explain why it is that you love someone. Quick example, why I think ultimately suffering could lead to the greater good would be 2 weeks before I went to college at York University, which is in Nebraska. I had it made up in my mind that I was going to go to ASU, and that's just where I was going to go. And 2 weeks before school started, I took a trip up to York, Nebraska, because I heard a couple of my buddies were going. And 2 weeks later, I was enrolled at York, Nebraska. And I thought, you know, here I am 10 hours away from home, you know, what am I doing here? And, you know, sort of 2-3 months go into school and things are not going really well. And I'm not really making a whole lot of new friends because, you know, 2 of my friends are playing baseball and then one's playing basketball. And then I'm thinking, man, what am I doing up here? And one night, there's actually a little chapel on campus that's open 24 hours a day. Anybody who wants to go into it, it's like a little quaint little chapel. And one night, all my friends had went out to Lincoln, which is about 45 minutes away. They went out for the night, and I stayed back because I couldn't make it in time. I was playing soccer, and I just walked on to the team. And I thought that'd make me happy and all this other stuff. And I couldn't get out of practice in time because they were having to leave by a certain time, and I couldn't make it. So I stayed home, and I remember going to that chapel in the middle of the night. And not in the middle of the night, not like 2 or 3 a.m. That'd be kind of creepy. But I remember going in, and it was like 8 o'clock, or I don't know what time it was. And I remember sort of sitting in the back. It's just like this little bitty sort of chapel, this sort of old style looking church. And I was sitting in the pew and thinking, man, what am I doing here? Like, why is this happening to me? Not that it's like a suffering as in pain or anything, but just I was sort of depressed. And a couple of students had walked in. They went upstairs. There's like a little balcony, and they had started singing from a hymnal. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. And then one student came in who was in my class, who I sort of knew. She said, hey, you can come up with us and sing if you want to. And I was like, nah, I think I'm probably about to leave anyway. It's not a big deal. And as they were singing upstairs, I started flipping through the hymnal, and I landed on this one song called At the Cross. Some of you probably heard that. At the cross, at the cross. That's the song. Anyway. And I was like, man, I really like that song. And they were just finishing up a song, and I don't know how many pages are in a hymnal, probably, 300 maybe, 200. Anyways, I started looking at that song, and I was like, man, that song, I really like that song. And then the very next song they started singing was that song. And then I knew, just based on that small little thing, I just started crying because I knew that's where I was supposed to be. And had I not, had I left or something, I might not have met a Mesa. I might not have been where I am today. So, saying that all suffering is bad, it very well could be the case. But we can't just make that assumption based on the information that we have. Saying that it's highly improbable, we have to sort of remember how finite our knowledge is in comparison towards what actually might be the case, if that makes sense. And that's basically all I had on my outline. And if there's any questions, or if Jonathan has anything that he wants to say, or if there's a question that you may have that I might not have made very much sense out of, or you thought, I don't really get that, maybe I can re-explain it or try to explain it in more detail. Or basically the whole idea behind it, what I wanted to show is not give an example of why God allows suffering. I don't think we can ever answer that. I think sometimes the greatest present we can give someone is our presence. Don't give them bad answers, just be there. And that alone is a good thing. And giving them bad answers is something that we should try to avoid, I guess. But in saying all that, that's really all I had. Is there anything you'd like to ask, or yes? Anything that you think I said that may be a contradiction? Maybe I can explain it. No? I'm open to answer any question.
Last one.
Go
At
ahead.
the beginning, you were talking about the logical problem, the logical side instead of the problem side. And you said that. I think it was your rebuttal or the explanation of the logical problem. But what you said is that God, considering God is omniscient or omnipotent, that he can't create a world in which there are logical
Contradiction?
contradictions.
I'm not.
Yeah, explain what you.
I don't think that he can. Now, some people like Martin Luther or Thomas Aquinas say that, of course he can. He can do whatever he wants. Well, if that's the case, then he can make any world that he can want, and it sort of gets rid of the whole problem of evil altogether. So God.
Why does that get rid of the problem?
Because if he can create a world in which there are logical contradictions, then he can create a world.
Free wills never make bad decisions.
Yeah, he can create a world to where I always make the right choice. And that evil is not necessarily a bad thing. Evil may be a good thing, you know? Does that make sense at all?
Mhm.
Like if he can create, if he can create a world in which in which evil is a good thing, I mean that would be a contradiction, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if he can create that world, logically, that doesn't make sense. But if he can create that, then it gets rid of the problem of evil because he can create a world in which evil is a good thing.
But there are people in the world that where actual pain is pleasure for them.
Like sadomasochism?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
and
just a perversion. Isn't it?
what's that?
That's just a perversion. I
It's
think.
just a perversion?
And anything can be perverted.
Well, say
Well, I know there's actual cases of people who have issues where there's just a neuron connected to the wrong place that they really do get pampered. Not like the masochist,
Oh,
but
yeah.
where they literally, like if you pinch them, they will get an erection. They will have
Perceived pleasure.
perceived pleasure just because of the way
Sure.
their brain's just miswired. It's just a birth defect.
Yeah.
Right. But if there is no God, then it wouldn't be a really sort of a miswiring. It would just be the way they are wired in general. You know, saying that it's
Yeah.
miswired would be sort of placing a value judgment on it, saying that it's wrong that it's like this. Well, if there's no God, then whatever's supposed to happen is just necessarily the case. There's a famous distinction of whether science can tell you what is, but it can't tell you what ought to be. David Hume makes that very clear in his work. So science can tell me everything that explains it, but it can't tell me why it's that way, or how it's that way, if that makes sense. Science is a great thing, but it can't tell us morality, for instance. It can't say why someone raping a child is necessarily wrong. We all sort of instinctively, objectively feel that that's a wrong thing, but science can't go in and say it's a wrong thing. It would just tell you that what's happening. Does that make sense at all?
Hey guys, it's last call on if anybody wants drinks or food. It's about 7-2.
I have a question. What about all this pain and suffering that's not connected to evil?
You're talking about, so there's moral suffering, and then you're talking about like the weather.
Like parasites that grow.
Yeah, parasites.
Yeah,
or
you're
just
talking
natural,
about
like
natural
hurricanes,
natural
things,
natural.
things that aren't connected to any
I
moral
don't-
decision.
I don't know.
That would be my biggest.
That would be,
complaint with-
yeah.
would be the-
I think
the
that's
suffering is-
one of the biggest complaints is like, why is there a hurricane that just wipes out? But see, if you get rid of that, it doesn't help you to say there's no God. Say, why is this that way? Well, if there's no God, then it just is that way. You know, there's no real answer for it in general. Like, so if you get rid of God in that scenario, it doesn't really help by saying, this is a bad thing. Because what do you mean by when you say bad? What foundation are you going off of? What are you talking about? Like, how is that bad? That's just what's happening right now in the world. That's just physics predetermining this earthquake that kills hundreds of people. I mean, it very well could be the case, like I was telling you about the butterfly effect, of where something that we cannot see, based on our own selfish greed and our own pride. I mean, Saint Augustine says the essence of sin is pride, is wanting to become like God. It's wanting to be our own God. And it very well could be the case. I'm not saying it is the case. I'm saying it very well could be the case that we do things that affect other people and maybe the weather. Maybe there are things that we do that affect that we just don't know and we can't know. I mean, that may be a bad answer, but I really don't know why. It's just the best thing that I can give you. But I mean, I've had a problem with that in the past. You know, why would God allow a hurricane to wipe out and kill thousands of innocent children?
I mean, I can understand
and I think the hurricane's the most.
Like Haiti and all that stuff?
No, as far as being like the easiest one to go to, but it's also the easiest explained as far as it's potentially necessary for different biological systems that need these upwellings of water, these currents to move nutrients around, these kind of things.
Sure.
I think the biggest question comes from when we talk about parasites that seemingly, even from a biological sense, seem to have no real place in the food chain as far as, I read an article earlier about 3,500 species of mosquitoes.
Yeah.
But only about 3 species of those are actually biologically necessary. And all of those 3 species, none of them carry the Zika virus, dengue fever, those kind of things. So, in a sense, it is a God, all-loving and all-powerful, to create a world in which He has these 2,997 different species of insect that are carrying harmful diseases that are harmful only to humans.
Sure.
If He did in fact create a world for us, I'm going off that presumption that
Yeah.
we assume that God has created this world for us.
What I would say in Christianity is that when God created the world, He created it perfect. And we're the ones who messed it up. So God created a world in which we had the freedom to choose between good and evil. And then from there, it could have sort of spiraled out of control, other different things that, because of our sin, may have caused these things to happen. But we just don't have enough information to say that's the case. And like I said earlier, even if let's just hypothetically say that God doesn't exist, like I mentioned earlier, to say that these mosquitoes that only hurt humans are a bad thing, what foundation would somebody have to say it's a bad thing? You know?
I'm just saying, the Christian concept that I can assume that's a bad thing. I know me personally don't care.
Yeah.
I find them annoying and wish I could get rid of them, but that's me as
Yeah,
a human. But who's affected by
find
the
mosquitoes really annoying as well.
But I mean, just the same way as like, my dog doesn't like heartworms, or they're bad
Sure.
for them.
Yeah.
The mosquitoes are bad for me personally, but not bad as an entire thing.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm just talking specifically from a Christian concept of a world is created
I think
for them to exist, for humans to exist in.
I think basically from a Christian concept, you could say 2 things. You could say, number 1, we don't know, or number 2, God created the world, and based on our own sort of sinful choices that we make, it affects other things. So you've heard in the Bible it talks about, the sins of the father are inherited, on the son. So the things that I do in life will not only affect me, but will affect my children later on. And I think the things that we do could necessarily affect other things in life that we just are just totally beyond our purview. We just can't make any significant statements about because we don't have the information. So that would be the 2 answers that I would say.
And that assumes that disease is bad, and that assumes that death is bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Painful, blistering death from bugs crawling up your ass seems pretty
Yeah.
good.
Well, there's actually.
Yeah. That's sort of an emotional stance, though, isn't it?
Yeah, that would be an emotional response to the problem of.
I mean, we can debate over whether the death itself is bad, but I think the manner in which someone goes to death, if there's an omnibenevolent God or whatever that loves you, what's the point of, if you, let's say you got bit by one of these mosquitoes all alone?